This podcast is brought to you by the Creation Academy Honors Program, an apologetics learning experience designed to teach, train, and inspire others to become strong defenders of the Christian faith and biblical creation. Launching early 2019, the program offers video and audio training with downloadable course workbooks, expert interviews, and exclusive Q&A sessions with leading creation scientists and apologists, quarterly ebooks covering a wide variety of subject matter, and even a private Facebook community where you'll fellowship and interact with a like-minded community of believers. If you want to be notified when the program goes live and even help us design the experience from the ground up, head on over to www.jointca.co today and sign up for the waitlist. You'll get early access to the private Facebook group for free as a thank you for joining. You're listening to The Steve Schramm Show, a weekly podcast defending the truth of God's Word in apologetics and creation science. Hope you're doing well this week. We have such an exciting interview for you this week and next week, actually. We went a little longer than I thought we would have the opportunity to, and I consider that a blessing. We got two great podcast episodes out of it. You're going to learn a lot. We're talking today with the editors of a new book called God and the World of Insects. We're talking to Josh Shoemaker and Dr. Gary Braness, and we're going to kind of skip the formalities here. I want to get right into the meat of this interview. So real quick, let me tell you a little bit about Josh and Gary. So Josh Shoemaker is an associate certified entomologist with over 20 years of experience in urban pest management. Now, he has taught hundreds of seminars on insect and arachnid biology and is a former adjunct professor at Arizona Christian University. He has an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola University, a great school over there, and has a degree in business with a minor in chemistry from Cal Poly. All right, now, Josh is also an associate certified entomologist, and certainly that shines through in the work he did in the book. It's absolutely great. Now, Dr. Gary Braness is a consulting entomologist and owner of Yosemite Environmental Services in Fresno, California. He obtained a PhD in urban and industrial entomology from Purdue University. Now, his research has been published in the Journal of Economic Entomology, and many of his articles have appeared in industry and trade magazines. This book has an A-list of contributors. It's absolutely great. So without further ado, let's get right into the first part of our interview with Josh Shoemaker and Dr. Gary Braness. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Gary and Josh.
Hello.
Hey, we're excited to have you on here, and we're going to talk about this new book, God and the World of Insects, and we are extremely excited about this. I've been reading it, devouring it more like for the past little while, and probably reading it a little slower and more methodically than they would like, but that's okay. I've taken my time and I've really enjoyed it. Guys, tell us just a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit about what you do, your interest in bugs and so forth. Josh, we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm a associate certified entomologist, and really that's a certification that specializes in urban entomology, and that's where I've been involved in the last 25 years, and primarily urban entomology is dealing with insects that are in and around homes and urban environments, and just a real passion of mine to be involved in that field. I imagine some of the things we'll talk about today in terms of controlling pest insects and helping human populations and thrive. And so that's just something I really enjoy. I have a master's degree in apologetics from Biola. So putting those two things together is kind of what brought me here.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. What a subject, man. I mean, just to show how how we can see design in nature, but looking at it through, I mean, the lens of bugs. I mean, I think that's very cool. So an apologetics degree and entomology degree, that is some special kind of combination, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. What about you, Gary?
Yeah, Steve. Well, I'm a husband. I can't believe it, but we've been married 40 years now, and I'm a father.
Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah. It just seems like, yeah. Well, in some ways, it seems like I've been married forever. In other ways, it seems like it was just yesterday. But I'm also a father of four, and have 8 grandchildren, which
Wow.
joy of my life. And of course, they're all well above average too. So I brag on them when I give presentations, and
Grandkids tend to be that way.
they are. They're really, really special. Yeah. So I try to spend as much time with them as I can. But I'm an entomologist, an urban entomologist. I have a degree from Purdue University. I studied German cockroaches there for 4 years to obtain my PhD. And I live in Fresno, California, and not far from Yosemite. And that's one of my favorite places to visit. It's just a beautiful place. And when I go there too, I see God when I'm out. Of course, I love insects and have grown up in the church and but still working on that part to try to be a better Christian. So
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, we guys like us, we live in this world of uh, theology and apologetics and even science. And so I always it annoys me if I'm just being honest when I hear people talk about, well, there's no compatibility between faith and science, or one of those. Here's my favorite atheist retort as of late: there is no evidence for God. Well, I beg to differ. And the gentleman that we have with us on today beg to differ. And not only that, but they beg to differ in an unlikely place that probably most of us have never explored before. So, insects. And I love it. And Josh and we had a brief phone conversation the day before we recorded this. And I told him that I was okay with all insects except for spiders. And so he's going to try, I think, his best to convert me over into a spider lover one of these days, but it's going to take a while, I think.
Well, actually, Steve, then you're actually okay with all insects, because spiders aren't insects; they're arachnids. So,
well, hey, all right,
Yeah.
I'm already look at that. Well, I guess I'm thinking of the bug, wider bug category, but nice correction.
Sure.
That's good. That's good. All right, guys. I mean, what was the motivation for writing a book on God and insects?
It's an interesting story, Steve, because originally this was just intended to be a small esoteric publication for some friends of ours in the urban pest management business. And we hadn't really thought about doing anything on a larger scale. And so I'm good friends with Fuzz Rana at Reasons to Believe.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, his daughter, one of his daughters, used to babysit my kids years ago. And so I was talking to him. I said, "Hey, Fuzz, I know this is just a small little thing, but would you mind contributing a chapter?" And he was immediately said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to do that." And next thing I know, he notifies a couple of people, and I started getting some contacts from other people saying, "Hey, I'm interested in contributing." And then really, I think ultimately what led to a book like this being produced was I was in church one Sunday, and our pastor was talking about how God raises up people that have certain specialties, and they're really well suited to do certain things. And the whole message really impacted me and made me think, wow, here I have a background in both entomology and a background in apologetics, and there's not really a book or anything out there that connects those two. Mm. And so I thought, with everything that was going on, with the people contacting me saying that they would like to contribute, then I sent out some other emails and got some other contributors, and it just exploded into this opportunity. And I mean, I have to think when I look back at that God was involved with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that, I mean, what a cool thing. I mean, just the way that God brought that all together and turned it into something huge. And now we're talking about it here. And, I mean, I'm no big fish, but I mean, I've got quite a few people who listen in, on a weekly basis. And so hopefully they'll spread it with other people and get this message out. I think it's really, really interesting. So tell me a little bit about the process. Who you already mentioned, Fuzz Rana, of course, over there at Reasons to Believe. Who are some of the folks that you collaborated with in the book, and did you choose any of them for a specific reason? Tell us about that.
So originally, when we had a lot of people reaching out again to me, there were a few people that contacted me and said that they had this idea for a chapter, and sometimes it didn't fit in. So it was really more about the topic and whether or not Gary and I thought that it would fit into the overall scope of the book. And again, the book is not just an apologetics book. We really wanted it to be a little bit broader than that. So the first half of the book is apologetics, but then the second half, it gets into some other areas. We wanted the focus really to be on insects. And so I think that, and try to cover all those aspects. Like we've even got the appendix in there where we talk about some Bible difficulties associated with with insects. So I think it was more about the topics that were suggested and what people said that they could write on.
I mean, just having recently read it, every chapter, in my opinion, is great. I mean, it's really, you can tell that when you read it, I mean, you can really tell that the people who contributed, they know their stuff. And, I mean, I say that and that sounds like, just a light thing. But the reason I say that is because they all just also happen to believe there is a God. And from an apologetic standpoint, it's like, yeah, I'm hammering this home. Like, let's not believe that, you have to keep your brain on one side, and your spiritual life on the other side. Because that's not how it works. And we live in God's world. And so God's world is going to naturally match up with God's word. Hey, this might be a good opportunity real quick to speak about some of the general diversity in the book. And to be honest, even the diversity amongst us. I mean, everybody who listens to this to this particular podcast is this is no secret, no strange thing at all, that I tend to be very friendly towards views who disagree. I am a young age creationist, a committed young age creationist. I teach young age creationism, has made up this is episode, I think, 66 of the podcast, and probably 63 of them have been specifically about something related to young age creationism. So that's what we talk about here, but we don't talk about it the same way a lot of other folks do. We really try to major on the central aspect of a design, and also on new research. We're not so much interested in disparaging folks who don't believe like us. That's not what we do around here. And both Josh and Gary hold views different than myself. Not only that, but I think they hold views different from each other. And most of the people in the book who contributed have views completely different from one another. And we all have a common goal here. The common goal is to find the design in nature and tell everybody else about it. I think that's a fair statement. Can you speak to that a little bit? I don't know if both of you want to say something or just whichever one, but what are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, that's a great point, Steve. And when we started putting this together, and we did have the folks approaching us and different people that we were talking to, one of the points that was key to both Gary and I is that we didn't want to create anything that was necessarily a book that would debate internally amongst Christianity what view is right. What we really wanted to try and create was something that was more evidential and showed that there is evidence out there for a designer behind insects. And so we wanted to try and stay away from, as much as we could, any of the internal discussions that you just mentioned. And again, just focus on more of an evangelical or and the design type arguments. And so that was really critical to us. And we approached people and we said, hey, we totally respect the different views that the different people hold. But we asked, in most cases, to if there's a particular point that relates to your chapter or argument and it's really necessary, and then you feel like you need to put it in there, try to maybe footnote it instead.
Right.
And so really all of the authors were terrific about that. And the goal was to find, like you mentioned, the common ground and to really focus on what we share in common. And the belief that we all share is that every single author that contributed to this book believes that when you look at the world of insects, that there is evidence that there is a designer behind that world of insects, that there is a God that has created those insects. And we all shared that belief. And so we really wanted to make that the real focus of the essence, especially of the first section of the book that's apologetically oriented.
Yeah.
And we wanted that, the real focus to be on the designer behind those insects.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, certainly there's a place for the other debate. There's a place for it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to, permeate each and every interaction that we have with our fellow brothers and sisters and with our, with our opponents, so to speak. And, let's just be honest. There's a lot of us who go to church with people, who do life with people who we completely disagree with on some very fundamental issues. And we don't ever fuss and farce with them over it, at least in a way that's not constructive. So I think we could do the same thing in this particular kind of discussion.
Yeah. And I think too, just to add to that, in Gary and I's experience, there are other Christian entomologists, but there's a lot of non-believers that are in the entomology community. And I think, Gary and I really had a heart for reaching those people. And if we got too focused on some of the internal debates and things like that, we were a bit concerned that it would detract them from the key points of the book, that there is a designer, start there. There's a designer, So,
Right. Yeah, I love that. Gary, what are your thoughts? You pretty much concur with Josh, I assume.
I really do, yes. And I found too in my reading and studying that biologists in general have they're so strongly tied to evolution and get that training early on in their careers that they have more problems with science and God. The physicists and astronomers and so forth, they seem to be on board with. They see the remarkable things in their area of expertise, and they're what I found, and in the reading I've done, most of them are believers and just are in awe of God in that. And from my own personal perspective, the whole process of getting involved with Josh and helping write the book in a chapter in that it goes all the way back to my early college days too, when I was starting to question, can I believe in God and still be a scientist? I enjoyed biology. I wanted to be a scientist and go on from there. And fortunately, I had two really great professors that I knew quite well. They happened to be entomologists. And I asked them that question on a road trip we were doing. And we had quite a very good discussion on that. And they basically told me that, yes, you can believe in both, be a good scientist and still believe in God. And so I was satisfied with that answer for many years. And then with the opportunity of getting involved in the book, I really had a chance to dig into it again, do a lot of reading, a lot of study, a lot of reflection. And after that, I'm even more convinced that I can believe in God and still be a scientist.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And speaking to the whole issue of different views and everything, I'm reminded of something my pastor says. Now, y'all, we're from North Carolina. We're from a place called Yadkinville, North Carolina. It's about as country as it comes. So I'll give you that caveat. But my pastor always says this, and I love it. He says, "A man's a fool that won't take another man's stick and beat the devil with it."
Oh, wow.
And of course, the point there is, if somebody else has got some good material, using it, grab it, man. Take that and beat the devil with it. Get it out there and just put it out there. And you don't have to agree with every person that you do ministry with, but what you do have to do is be faithful to what God has asked. And I believe we find that all throughout the Bible, that we're to share and evangelize. And I'm with you on using your gifts and your talents, doing the things that you know how to do that are unique to you, to use that in your evangelism. So I think that's awesome. Okay, we're going to get into some of the more specific questions here, but real quick, I want to ask you both, if you had to choose, what would be your favorite insect example from the book that evidences a designer? Well, I mean, if you just had one favorite insect, what would it be?
So I actually get asked that a lot when I talk about this. What's the best argument you have?
Right.
And honestly, Steve, I've thought about it. I can't think of one that I would say is so far ahead of the others, and I think that's because there's so many good ones.
Yeah.
And I mean, Metamorphosis is a great one. Bee Vision with the compound eye. Matt's chapter on parasites is great. I mean, there are so many really powerful arguments that it's hard for me to nail down just one. I mean, I do have maybe some favorites, and we'll probably get into those as we go a little bit more. They'll come out.
Okay,
But
all right.
I don't know that, even though they're my favorite, it maybe not necessarily that I think they're the best. They just happen to be ones that I like talking about more,
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. What about you, Gary? Is it you have a favorite example?
Well, I agree with Josh. It's hard to come up with a favorite, but since I wrote the chapter on ants, of course, I have to go with ants.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I often say ants are number one. So.
Wow. Well, I'm gonna ask you a little bit about that. I do have at least one question that's about the ants. So we're gonna get into that. And actually, just before reading this, I was reading another book by a brother y'all might know. I'm not sure. His name is Andy Walsh. He wrote a book recently called "Faith Across the Multiverse," and he has a chapter on there on ants. And I just was like,
oh, wow.
Yeah, I was blown away.
I'm not familiar with that. I have to get that.
Yeah, it's a great book. Super great book. So I'll recommend that one too. I did a book review on it on the blog. Everybody can go check out. But anyway, but yeah, so I've got a double whammy on the ants here recently, and I think I'd have to concur. I think those are some of the coolest. It was either your book or his book. I can't remember which one. It might have been both. Oh no, it was definitely yours. Where I was reading about these super huge ant colonies, like just miles and miles. I mean, I'm probably not even doing it justice, but I think one of them is called what's it called? The Great Big Colony or something like that. It's I forget what it's called. It's out there in California, I think.
Yeah, the giant ant colony, I believe it is.
The giant ant colony. What a perfect name.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. So, very cool. Okay. All right. Well, let's get into this a little bit. Let's dive in. So, all right, Josh, now you open the book with a particularly fascinating chapter on the subject of convergence. And when I say convergence, what we mean is similarities that can be seen across the animal kingdom in, seemingly unrelated organisms. So here's what you say, quote, "Could it be that the undirected processes of natural selection and random mutations repeatedly produce similar outcomes that have the appearance of being designed because they are exposed to parallel environmental pressure, parallel environmental pressures? Perhaps. Yet some examples of convergence are striking. They involve completely different external pressures, different root morphologies, and even different genetics." End quote. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Give us your general thoughts about convergence.
Yeah, so really to unpack it, I think it'd be best to back up just a bit. As you mentioned, convergence is when we see these like traits developing across unrelated organisms. So a real common example that's often cited is echolocation. That's in bats and dolphins.
Yeah.
So you have these traits that develop in completely unrelated insects. Or I'm sorry, completely related, unrelated organisms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the insect world, there's just a multitude of examples. And now why convergence is significant, though, is if you even go back to Darwin, at the end of On the Origin of Species, he talks about that evolution would produce, and I think his actual quote is, "endless forms most beautiful." So, and what he's talking about is that evolution would just continue to produce all these different things. And that was discussed more by Stephen Jay Gould. And when he talked about something, he gave an example of rewinding like a VCR, the old VCR tapes. And if you were to take evolution and turn it backwards several years and then turn it back forward and let it go again, he says that you get something completely different, and the outcome would be totally different. The interesting thing about this, though, is that's not what we've seen when we observe nature. And a real example that I like to explain or use is stick insects. Because everybody's familiar with the stick insect. These little tiny, thin stick insects that resemble twigs and branches, and we see them crawling around a lot. And so I think most people are familiar with that. Well, there's a certain group of stick insects that are called tree lobsters. And that's because they're really big, thick, and stout, and they have they kind of resemble the stoutness of a lobster, I guess. But they're a stick insect, and there's these particular groups of them that were they're on different islands and different locations, and it was originally thought that all of the tree lobsters were related to one another, and that they had a common ancestor, and that there was something about the separation of these land masses that caused them to have some slight modifications, because they do look different. I mean, they're different species of tree lobster. But what was discovered when they did a DNA analysis is, wait a minute, none of these are actually related. They all independently evolved, if that's indeed what happened. They all independently evolved into becoming tree lobsters that not only look like one another, but they even exhibit these common egg-laying patterns. Like most stick insects, they kind of flick or drop their eggs kind of randomly, so it looks like scattered seeds. Mm-hmm. But all the tree lobsters bury their eggs. But so again, from an evolutionary standpoint, when that was originally looked at, and it was universally thought in the past that, hey, all of these must have come from one common ancestor that were then separated by geography, and then now they've kind of had these small modifications, and that's why they look a little bit different now. But instead, what we've discovered through DNA analysis is, no, these are all related to, or these are not related to one another. They all must have independently evolved. Now, that's really striking, because that's contrary to what you would expect, right?
Yeah.
And so when we look at that, we have this convergence pattern. So you have to then have a reason for what's bringing that about. And so the response has, from the evolutionary biologist community, has been, well, it's probably because there's these evolutionary constraints. And so this term evolutionary constraint has been applied by some, right?
Right.
And this is really interesting, because what they would suggest, and it makes sense, that there's the laws of physics and geometry, and so mathematics and physics are contributing to constraining organisms to only have opportunity to evolve in certain directions. And so there's a limited amount of ways that evolution can go. But this in itself has some interesting implications, because first of all, the question is, well, what is driving those, or what is creating those constraints? They talk about the physics and the geometry. And so, there's a lot of Christian apologists who've written about fine-tuning and such. You don't really see that in biology. But as Gary mentioned earlier, in physics and a lot of other disciplines, we see people talking about fine-tuning. Well, there are a number of constants that have to be fine-tuned, that if you're then going to say that there's an evolutionary constraint. So if there's something that is driving it, it's because these constants are fine-tuned. So that really kind of begs the question then, well, where's the fine-tuning coming from? And so ultimately, I mean, when you kind of package what we see with convergence, and we see, I mean, and it goes way beyond that. I gave one example there of stick insects, but I mean, bioluminescence is another one. There's so many different things where we see that have independently evolved, if you will, in all these different groups of insects, where we see the same things over and over. And there's a evolutionary biologist by the name of Simon Conway Morris, and he has a great book that really discusses this whole issue and this massive amount of convergence that we see. And what he concludes in the book is that everything about humans is convergent. Like all of the things that make up our attributes and the things about us are convergent. So what he says is, boy, it sure looks like if everything about us is convergent, that we're the inevitable outcome of evolution. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it is heading and it's going to make humans. I mean, that's just, if the world is, and evolution is really what drives everything forward, it's going to make humans. Now, where this to me is really significant and important is I look at biological convergence and I say that there's really only three possible explanations for it. And the first explanation would be to take an atheistic approach or a naturalistic approach and just say, hey, all of convergence is out there, or the reason for convergence is because it's just a brute fact. That's just the way things are. But I mean, then you're still, but in order to come at this brute fact, you're relying on all this fine tuning and all these things that have to be exactly right for this to happen. So it's just pure coincidence, and it's just fortuitous that we have these things that everything winds up pointing to us. I mean, that seems like a real stretch. So then the second option that you have is that there's some sort of a theistic evolution where God set it up in advance and everything is coming to fruition the way that he had intended based on the properties of the universe. And so I think what's interesting to me about that is that it kind of takes away one of the biggest criticisms that people have of theistic evolution, in that that theistic evolution makes it appear like it's an unguided process. Mm-hmm. Because when you take in the evidence from convergence, it really starts to look like it's a guided process, if indeed that's what it is. But then there's the third option as well, and this is what I think is so interesting about convergence, is the third option is a really powerful argument of a designer. I mean, even though the second one has a designer as well, the third one is that maybe it's just a common blueprint. In other words, you see one organism here, and this is something that works really well, so it makes sense that God would use that same design and that same blueprint when creating, whether through special creation, another organism over here with those same attributes. So it's just like when someone builds a car, a car works. So if I'm going to make another car, it's going to look a lot like that one. There may be some different things, but it's going to look a lot like that one because I've built something that works really well. Yeah. And so I think what's interesting to me about convergence, again, is there's only three possible outcomes or three possible reasons where convergence can adequately explain convergence. And one of those three, I mean, it just doesn't, there's no reason at all to believe that this is just a brute, it's a brute fact. It's fortuitous. We're lucky to be here. And it's just a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, to be honest with you, as I was thinking about that, the last two episodes of the podcast before this one goes out actually were about logical fallacies. And I immediately, when that jumped out at me, because I hear this objection all the time, like whenever something is difficult to explain, well, that's just the way the universe is. It's a brute fact, where, it's like the guy who, what was it, Alan Guth, who said that the universe is just the ultimate free lunch. This is a logical fallacy. This is the fallacy of irrelevant thesis. All you have done is tell me that we're here. Well, we already know we're here. We need a why. We need a why, an answer to the question. And there is no answer to the question when you just say, oh, this is the way things are. To me, that's not satisfactory. And I suspect it's not to either of y'all either. No. And, I mean, that's absolutely amazing. Gary, do you have any thoughts on this particular thing? Or?
Well, I think Josh really covered that terrifically. I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to that. Since I have the microphone now, if I could just step back a minute, I misspoke when I mentioned the name for that large super colony in California. It's not the giant ant colony, but it's called the very large colony.
Make sure to get that one right, Gary.
As a scientist, I got to make sure I get it right. But it is amazing where ants from, say, San Francisco, all the way down to where near Josh lives in San Diego, they're part of that same colony, and you can put them together and they won't fight. Wow! But then there's a smaller colony called the Hodges colony. Hopefully, I get this right. And that's in Southern California as well. And when you put group ants from those two groups together, they'll fight to the death. And in fact, each year on the border there, millions of ants that are killed as they.
Yeah, I go mountain biking out there and out by Lake Hodges, Gary. So yeah, you can see the wars going on sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
Wow, man, that is absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Just want to clear the record on that one.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. That is absolutely great. All right. So yeah, I mean, so convergence. So it already seems like we're off to a great start. We're only really one good thing into the book, and we've already got a pretty big challenge to naturalistic, Darwinism. I mean, we're already off to the races here. It looks like no matter which view you take, you're going to have to admit some sort of design. And this might be a good place to mention, I mean, this is not a secret to evolutionists. In other words, let me put it this way, I mean, Dawkins himself, one of the most well-known, atheistic biologists, evolutionary biologists there is, he wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker. And in a sense, this was the subject matter. I don't know how much in it he speaks to convergence, but it's certainly, he wants to say that when we look at nature, we see design. But guess what his explanation for that is? Evolution. Evolution has tricked us, and evolution has fooled us into seeing design in nature. So it seems like evolution is just the unfalsifiable, explanation that it can seemingly account for everything. And you know what they say about things that account for everything? Sometimes, depending on what it is, it won't account for anything. You have to be able to falsify what you're proposing. And so I think that's really interesting that even the most atheistic of biologists want to some degree admit that we see design, but apparently, again, we're just supposed to see design because that's what evolution has done. So it all goes back to this logical fallacy for me. It's, you haven't really given us anything substantive. There's no answer there. It's just kind of, back to the drawing board. So that's great. Well, hey, let's move the conversation a little bit. Let's talk about beetles. So in the book, Rick Gerhardt mentions the infamous suggestion by J.B.S. Haldane, and he was, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was an evolutionary biologist of days gone by. It was the 20th century, I believe, that if a creator exists, he has an inordinate fondness for stars and for beetles. So he mentions the cosmic mass density as kind of a teleological sort of apologetic for the existence of so many stars, which is very interesting. However, our conversation is about something on a bit smaller scale than the universe. So what about beetles then? Rick writes that each of the ecological roles played by animals as a collective is performed by one or more species of beetle. Man, when I read that, I was totally blown away. I thought, how is that even possible? It sounds extraordinary. Gary, let me ask you on this one. I mean, what kind of things do beetles do for the environment?
Well, they're really important in the environment, and the thing too is that basically they live everywhere and do everything. It's kind of a quick way to sum it up. But
wow.
If we look at the number of beetles, there's about 350,000 described species of beetles in the world. But there's many more that have not been discovered yet. So that number will grow. And just to put it in perspective, my favorite group of insects, the ants, there's about 14,000 described species. And despite their great success, they, far fewer species than there are beetles.
Wow.
So being everywhere, doing everything, some of the contributions they have to our environment is that many of them will feed on other insects and arachnids and so forth. And some of which are pests, so it helps control our pests.
They feed on arachnids. I'm liking them better already.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, they're very good hunters. And some also will feed on plants, which many are weeds, and so it helps in weed control. In some areas, beetles are introduced as a biological control for weeds and so forth. And now, also as hunters, they sometimes are food for larger animals too. So it helps in that. They're pollinators is another example. We always think of bees as pollinators, but beetles too contribute a great deal on that. I enjoy photography. I do a lot of macro photography of wildflowers and insects, and it amazes me. I come home with my photos, and I look closely at the flower I've taken, and there's a tiny little beetle on the flower, which is contributing to the pollination. I don't even see it until I magnify it with the macro photography. And so that's just a few of the things. And also, in my mind, they just make our life more interesting.
Don't forget about poop, Gary.
What's that?
Don't forget about poop, what they do for us there.
Oh yeah. Well, absolutely. I was going to leave that for you, Josh, to comment. But I could tell a story. Josh knows this, but I'm not going to go there right now about my thesis. And but I'll just leave it at that. But yes, they do decompose organic materials and so forth. So they're just tremendous in what they do.
Yeah. That's incredible. Can you repeat one more time how many species you said there was of beetle?
Yeah, there's I looked this up recently. There's currently it's believed there's about 350,000 species of beetles.
Wow.
And that's the largest order of insects, and of course they're in the order Coleoptera.
Wow. Goodness, man, that's incredible. And only 14,000 in comparison of ants. That's something.
And ants are everywhere too, so yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and so I mean the fact that they're they live everywhere and they do everything, I think that's interesting, especially considering Haldane's suggestion. I mean, I think needless to say, he spoke a little bit too soon. There are, as a matter of fact, good reasons. And I hear this, this kind of thing too all the time. I mean, talking about the stars thing, it's like, we're alone in the universe. I draw a completely opposite conclusion on that. The fact that you've got this expansive universe, and yet here we are, just this one, some people say, this one insignificant planet near this one insignificant star, surrounded by a couple other insignificant little moons, whatever it is. But I'm just like, man, the fact that out of all of that God created, I don't even know how many trillions of light years the universe is across, but that God loves us and his eyes on us. And I read Matthew 6, and we start talking about the fact that that he cares for, the birds of the field, and he's arrayed the lilies and all of this, and how much does he love and care for us? Just to get a little theological and a little spiritual, I think that's incredible.
So Steve, I want to add something real quick. It's not insect related, but it's related to the discussion here. Recently, my son and I were having a conversation, and he was really interested in the fact that we were watching one of these videos that people produce on like looking at space and zooming in. It was like one of those things where you could zoom in and zoom out. So it basically showed, starting at a human, you zoom all the way out and how big space is, and then you zoom all the way in and how small of a particle we can see. And he said, Dad, it's really crazy. We're right in the middle. I was like, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I certainly don't want to go too far into this discussion, but there, some of the being a young age creation, and some of the starlight models and things kind of toss out the cosmological principle, which says that, the cosmological principle basically says that we're not, and that there is no special place in the universe. There is no favored place in the universe. And so sometimes some of the young age creationist models for starlight and things like that toss that out. And so I don't know. I think
he wasn't saying that we're in the middle of the universe. He was saying that in size-wise, like we're.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's like there's things, the magnitudes larger than us versus the magnitude smaller.
I see.
We're right in the center of the size of everything.
Gotcha. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I missed that. Okay. Well, that's cool. That's great. But I mean, just to finish that thought, what if we were at the center of the universe? I think that'd be pretty cool. I think, that's just the way that, that God loves and cares for us. I think that's incredible. And we can see it all around us. And so he was saying that we are about the, average size or right in the middle size of the biggest things and the largest things that we can, or the smallest, that we observe. Oh, very, very cool. Very cool. And from the mouth of babes, right? That's very, very cool. Okay, so Gerhardt claims in the book, and I didn't write down what chapter this was, so forgive me there, but I might have been the same one talking about beetles. He says,
it is,
okay, yeah. So he says that, I'm going to quote him here, the physical similarity among all living things is best explained as ecological necessity. Humans, plants, birds, amphibians, and lightning bugs are all a part of the same great ecosystem, and every component is designed, there's that word, in such a way that its individual atoms and molecules are useful to and used by other components. There's nothing random or unintended about this marvelous system of systems within systems. What a claim. What do you guys make of that?
Well, I think the statement kind of stands on its own. I mean, it's the fact is that, and we've been talking about it, that how like beetles fill all these ecological niches, and there's a necessity and a purpose for every one of the insects that are in these ecological niches. And so it goes right against what we were just talking about, Haldane, his quote that where he's trying to imply that since there's all these different beetles, there must not be a God. But this flies in the face of that. There's absolutely a purpose for all of these different creatures. There's a system that is a complex system where everything is working together. And I use the psalm in the chapter that I have on convergence too. And I think as that system as the system changes. Let's see if I can find the psalm. But as the system changes, there are different species that fill in the ecological niches.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean,
Psalm 104. Yeah, it's from Psalm 104.
Psalm 104. Good deal. Yeah. And that, what an amazing thought that, things, it's just too. That's another thing my pastor says. It's just too real not to be real. The design that you see, it's just too real not to be real. Just how everybody works together. And I don't know. I think in one of the, it might have been a little bit in Gerhardt's chapter. I think in other chapters too, that the whole thing of symbiosis was mentioned a little bit. Everybody depends on one another. There are. And I think that's somewhat of an irreducibly complex argument too, is to say that, some of these symbiotic relationships seem really, really, it's really, really strange that we would see these kind of things to pop up without any kind of intended design being part of the mix. All right, well, that is it for part 1 of our interview with Josh Shoemaker and Dr. Gary Braness on God and the World of Insects. Certainly hope you enjoyed everything that we discussed in this first part. If nothing else, I hope you're excited for part 2, because this is certainly an exciting book. I encourage you to get the book. It's a great read. It's not that expensive. Go out and grab this book. You're going to get a wealth of information from a wealth of knowledgeable people. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Hey, let's close out in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we love and appreciate you and thankful, Lord, for even the smallest of creatures, Lord, that you've given us in this world to study and appreciate and even to learn from. Father, it's just a blessing, Lord, that we get to study your world, to take dominion over this earth, and to interact with your creation in the way that you ordained us to do. We love you, Father, and thank you so much for the opportunity to become a son of God. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, again, thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next time, and I encourage you to like, share, rate, review this podcast if it helps you, if you enjoy it. We'd really appreciate that. If you're a first-time listener, head to steveschramm.com/defend. We want to send you a free course just for being a part of what we're doing here. All right, thanks. God bless. See you next week, and bye-bye.